The emergency alarm shattered the steady rhythm of the trauma center before anyone had time to finish a sentence. Stretchers burst through the automatic doors one after another, blood-soaked blankets trailing across polished floors while exhausted paramedics shouted fractured reports over the rising chorus of monitors and hurried footsteps. Somewhere in the confusion, a young father fought to breathe as a shard of twisted steel pressed dangerously close to his heart, and within seconds the operating room became a battlefield where every decision carried the weight of an entire future. The overhead lights washed everything in brilliant white, revealing every trembling hand, every anxious glance, every second slipping away. Most of the staff had survived difficult nights before, but something about this one felt different. Fear had settled into the room long before the first incision could even be made. Chief Surgeon Dr. Nathan Reeves stood at the center of the operating theater, his reputation built over 3 decades of impossible surgeries that had become medical case studies across the country. He rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. Confidence surrounded him like another layer of sterile clothing. Residents trusted him. Nurses respected him. Families prayed that he would be the one standing over their loved ones when hope began to disappear. Yet, even he could see that the patient's condition was collapsing faster than anyone expected. Blood pressure continued to fall despite every intervention. The heart rhythm became unstable. A monitor released a sharp warning tone that echoed against the steel cabinets. One of the younger surgeons quietly stepped backward, realizing that conventional procedures were running out of time. Standing only a few feet away was surgical nurse Emily Carter. Few people noticed her when she entered a room because she never demanded attention. She was in her early 30s, wearing the same blue surgical scrubs as everyone else, her dark hair secured beneath a cap with such precision that not a single strand escaped. Her movements carried an unusual economy. She never rushed, yet somehow she always arrived exactly where she was needed before anyone called her name. Even under the unforgiving operating lights, there was something unusually calm about her eyes. They did not ignore fear. They simply refused to surrender to it. Most of her colleagues assumed she had developed composure through years of emergency medicine. None of them imagined there was another reason entirely. As Dr. Reeves examined the imaging displayed on the overhead monitor, frustration briefly crossed his face. The fragment had shifted again. Attempting the standard approach would almost certainly trigger catastrophic bleeding. Every option seemed to make the next one worse. Around the operating table, silence slowly replaced conversation. Even the experienced anesthesiologist looked uncertain. Then Emily quietly leaned forward. She did not interrupt. She simply looked once at the monitor, once at the patient's chest, and once at the instruments waiting on the tray. There was no hesitation in her expression, only calculation. She spoke softly enough that only those closest could hear. "We cannot approach from there. The vessel will rupture before exposure is complete." Several surgeons turned toward her, surprised less by the suggestion than by the certainty in her voice. Dr. Reeves barely looked up. "This procedure isn't performed that way." Emily's eyes never left the patient. "Not here," she answered gently. "But it can be." Another warning alarm sounded. Blood pressure continued falling. Every second narrowed their choices. Dr. Reeves studied the imaging again, realizing she had noticed something that everyone else had overlooked. The angle of penetration had created a tiny protected corridor beneath damaged tissue. It was impossibly narrow. No civilian textbook recommended using it. One slip would mean immediate death. One of the residents whispered that it was too dangerous. Emily remained completely still. She did not argue. She simply waited. Her breathing stayed slow while everyone else's became faster. Finally, Dr. Reeves stepped aside just enough to give her access to the imaging display. "Show me," he said. Emily traced an invisible path through the scan with one gloved finger, describing each anatomical landmark with remarkable precision. She spoke without searching for words, as though she had followed this exact route countless times before. The operating room grew strangely quiet. Even the skeptical residents stopped objecting. There was an unsettling confidence in the way she explained every movement, every angle, every possible complication before anyone else had thought to mention it. Dr. Reeves felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts. It was not doubt. It was curiosity. He had attended elite surgical conferences across the world. He had trained under internationally respected trauma specialists. Yet he had never encountered this approach. "Where did you see this?" he asked. Emily looked at the patient instead of answering. "We are losing him." Dr. Reeves glanced back at the monitor. She was right. Another minute of debate would end the conversation forever. "Make the exposure," he ordered. The room instantly came alive again. Instruments moved into waiting hands. Suction activated. Bright surgical lights shifted into new positions. Emily assisted with movements so fluid they almost appeared rehearsed. She anticipated each instrument before it was requested. Every adjustment seemed perfectly timed with the surgeon's hands. Yet when Dr. Reeves reached the critical point where disaster had seemed inevitable, Emily quietly spoke 3 words. 2 millimeters lower. He paused. Against decades of instinct, he followed her instruction. Suddenly the hidden vessel appeared exactly where she predicted. A collective breath escaped the operating room. The impossible corridor existed. The fragment could now be removed without tearing the artery apart. The resident standing opposite nearly forgot to breathe. The anesthesiologist looked up from the monitors in disbelief as blood pressure stabilized for the first time since the patient entered surgery. No one spoke. They simply watched as catastrophe slowly transformed into possibility. Minutes later, the fragment rested harmlessly inside a stainless steel tray. The bleeding stopped. The damaged tissue was repaired. A heartbeat that had nearly vanished returned to a steady rhythm. Relief spread quietly across exhausted faces, but no one celebrated. Every eye drifted toward Emily. She had already resumed organizing instruments, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She accepted no praise. She sought no acknowledgement. It was simply another patient who had survived the night. Dr. Reeves removed his gloves slowly, unable to shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something far beyond exceptional nursing judgment. He replayed every instruction she had given, every movement she had anticipated, every anatomical detail she had known before the imaging fully revealed it. None of it belonged to ordinary hospital experience. None of it belonged to any surgical curriculum he had ever taught. As the patient was wheeled toward intensive care, the operating room remained unusually silent. Staff members exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for someone else to explain what they had just seen. Finally, with the doors closing behind the stretcher, Dr. Reeves turned toward Emily. His voice was calm, but beneath it rested a question that refused to stay unanswered. He looked directly into her steady eyes and asked, "Who taught you that procedure?" Emily's hand stopped moving for the first time all night. A memory she had buried years ago flashed silently across her face before disappearing just as quickly. She lowered her eyes, drew one careful breath, and realized that the answer to that single question threatened to uncover a past she had spent years making sure no one would ever find. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital's glass atrium, but its warmth never reached the surgical wing. The story of the previous night's operation had already spread beyond the operating room, carried not by celebration but by quiet disbelief. Residents replayed every moment in whispered conversations over coffee that had long since gone cold. Veteran nurses, who had witnessed decades of extraordinary medicine, admitted they had never seen a trauma case reversed with such precision. Yet the name repeated most often was not Dr. Nathan Reeves, whose reputation had defined the hospital for years. It was Emily Carter, the nurse who had spoken only a handful of words before changing the outcome of a surgery everyone else had believed was already lost. Emily moved through the corridors exactly as she always had, greeting patients with the same gentle smile, adjusting blankets with the same careful hands, stopping long enough to reassure frightened families before disappearing into another room. If the attention unsettled her, she never allowed it to show. She understood something most people never learned. Recognition could become more dangerous than failure when it illuminated the parts of a life meant to remain in shadow. Before noon, Dr. Reeves requested a private meeting in his office. His shelves overflowed with medical journals, surgical awards, and framed photographs taken beside world-renowned physicians, yet none of those accomplishments occupied his thoughts as Emily entered and quietly closed the door behind her. He studied her for several seconds, searching not for guilt but for honesty. He had spent a career reading faces during moments of impossible pressure. Patients lied out of fear. Families lied out of hope. Doctors sometimes lied to protect their pride. Emily's expression held none of those things. It carried only the practiced calm of someone who had spent years standing between life and death. He invited her to sit, but she remained standing. "I reviewed every recording from last night's surgery," he said carefully. "I searched every trauma manual I own. I contacted colleagues overseas before sunrise. No one recognizes that approach." Emily remained silent. He continued, "You knew anatomical landmarks that weren't visible. You predicted complications before they developed. That wasn't intuition. That was training." She lowered her eyes toward the polished wooden floor. "Some lessons are learned where textbooks cannot reach," she answered softly. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. "Military?" She offered no reply. "Humanitarian missions?" Still nothing. Finally he asked the question more directly. "Were you ever attached to a government medical unit?" Emily looked toward the office window where helicopters occasionally crossed the skyline before disappearing beyond the city. Her silence became an answer without becoming a confession. The meeting ended without resolution, but curiosity had already escaped the room. Hospital administrators began reviewing employment records. Human Resources verified every degree, every certification, every previous hospital assignment. Everything appeared ordinary. Almost too ordinary. Her personnel file contained no disciplinary actions, no unusual commendations, no unexplained absences. It was the kind of record that should have ended every question, yet somehow it created even more. Because extraordinary skill had somehow emerged from an entirely ordinary history. By late afternoon, another emergency shattered whatever normal rhythm the hospital had begun to recover. A passenger bus had collided with a fuel truck on the interstate, sending dozens of critically injured patients toward the trauma center. Ambulances arrived almost continuously. Stretchers filled hallways. Blood banks activated emergency protocols. Surgeons divided into teams before the first victims even reached triage. Chaos returned with even greater force than the night before. Emily immediately joined the trauma response, moving through crowded corridors with remarkable composure. She noticed details others missed: the child whose breathing pattern changed before monitors reacted, the elderly woman whose quiet confusion signaled internal bleeding rather than shock, the firefighter refusing treatment despite burns because he believed others needed help more than he did. She spoke gently to each of them, never raising her voice, never allowing urgency to erase compassion. In the largest operating suite, a young paramedic lay unconscious after shielding 2 children during the explosion. Metal fragments had torn through his abdomen, and extensive internal injuries left almost no room for error. Dr. Reeves led the operation, while 2 assistant surgeons struggled to control relentless bleeding. Every intervention seemed to buy only seconds. Blood pressure fell again. The heart rhythm weakened. Suction filled faster than it could be emptied. The operating room tightened beneath invisible pressure. Emily watched quietly from across the table. Then she noticed something almost impossible to see. The pattern of bleeding had shifted. Not because the injuries had worsened, but because one hidden vessel had begun feeding another damaged pathway beneath swollen tissue. Traditional exposure would consume precious minutes the patient no longer possessed. She knew another approach existed. She also knew exactly where she had learned it. Years earlier, beneath blackout skies and the thunder of helicopter rotors, she had stood inside improvised surgical shelters where electricity failed without warning and every patient arrived carrying wounds no civilian hospital could imagine. There had been no applause there. No medical conferences. Only impossible choices measured in heartbeats. Before every deployment, every medic had accepted the same instruction. What happens here remains here. The techniques. The locations. The people. Silence protected those still serving. Silence saved lives long after missions ended. Emily had carried that promise into civilian life as faithfully as any oath she had ever spoken. Now it stood between that promise and the man dying before her. Dr. Reeves struggled to gain control. Another surgeon suggested abandoning the repair to prevent complete cardiac collapse. Emily felt the familiar weight settling across her shoulders. She had carried it years ago, while aircraft engines screamed overhead and wounded soldiers waited their turn beneath camouflage netting. She had promised herself never to return mentally to those nights. Yet those nights had never truly released her. The operating room grew strangely quiet. No one spoke. The alarm seemed farther away. Even the suction faded beneath the sound of measured breathing. For one suspended moment, every person stood perfectly still, waiting for someone to choose. Emily stepped forward. Her voice remained calm. "If we continue this way, he dies." Dr. Reeves looked directly at her. "Then show us another way." She hesitated. Not because she doubted the medicine. Because she understood the cost of explaining it. Some knowledge belonged to places that officially never existed. Some teachers could never be acknowledged without breaking promises made long ago. Another heartbeat passed. The patient's pulse weakened again. Emily realized that protecting a secret meant nothing if it required watching an innocent life disappear. She guided the surgeons through an unconventional sequence of controlled exposure and vascular isolation unlike anything they had practiced before. Every instruction arrived seconds before it became necessary. Every movement unfolded with astonishing precision. Slowly, impossibly, the bleeding eased. Blood pressure climbed. Color returned to the patient's face. One resident quietly removed his fog protective visor just to make certain he had witnessed reality. When the final repair was completed, no one moved. The operation had succeeded, but the silence afterward felt heavier than the crisis itself. Dr. Reeves removed his mask and looked at Emily with an expression no longer shaped by suspicion. It was respect mixed with profound curiosity. He walked toward her until only a few feet separated them. The operating room remained absolutely still. Everyone waited. His voice was almost a whisper. "I've spent 35 years learning surgery, and today you taught me something I didn't know existed. Please, who taught you?" Emily closed her eyes for only a moment. She remembered rotor blades cutting through darkness. Dust swirling beneath landing lights. Wounded faces illuminated by red emergency lamps. A commander reminding every member of the medical team that the mission would never belong in history books. When she opened her eyes again, they carried both sorrow and peace. She answered so quietly that those nearest almost questioned whether they had heard her at all. Task Force 160. The room fell completely silent. Every assumption anyone had made about the quiet surgical nurse vanished in a single whispered sentence. And at that moment everyone realized they had never truly known the woman who had been saving lives beside them all along. The words lingered in the operating room long after Emily had spoken them, not because everyone understood their meaning, but because they understood the weight with which they had been delivered. No one asked another question. Even those unfamiliar with military aviation recognized that certain names were spoken quietly for a reason. Dr. Nathan Reeves looked at the woman who had stood beside him for nearly 4 years and realized he had spent all that time measuring her by the title stitched onto her hospital badge rather than the life hidden behind it. She was not trying to impress anyone. She never had been. She had simply carried knowledge earned in places where survival depended upon perfect decisions made in impossible circumstances. The silence broke only when another trauma call echoed through the surgical wing. The hospital did not pause for revelation. Ambulance doors opened. Another patient arrived. Another family prayed. Another life balanced on the narrow edge between hope and loss. Emily pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and walked toward the emergency department without another word, leaving behind a room filled with people who suddenly viewed ordinary things differently. Over the following days, rumors spread far beyond the hospital walls. Some exaggerated her past into unbelievable legends. Others dismissed the whispers as impossible stories born from exhaustion after a difficult night. Hospital administrators requested meetings. Journalists began calling the public relations office after someone anonymously mentioned an extraordinary nurse connected to military medicine. Invitations arrived from medical conferences asking whether she would demonstrate advanced trauma techniques. Several universities expressed interest in offering teaching positions. Emily politely declined every request. She had not stepped into medicine to become famous. She had stepped into it because somewhere, years earlier, she had learned that every human life deserved the same relentless effort, whether anyone remembered the name of the person providing it or not. Dr. Reeves found her one evening sitting alone in the hospital garden after a 14-hour shift. The courtyard was quiet except for the distant sound of water flowing through a small stone fountain. Summer sunlight had begun fading behind the buildings, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and blue. Emily watched a family walking toward the parking lot, their young daughter laughing as she held tightly to her father's hand. He sat beside her without speaking. For several minutes neither of them interrupted the silence. Finally he said, "I spent years believing experience meant collecting titles, publishing research, and standing at podiums. Then you arrived and reminded me that the greatest lessons sometimes come from people who never tell their stories." Emily smiled faintly. "The people who taught me rarely had the chance to tell theirs." Dr. Reeves looked toward the fountain. "Were you a surgeon?" She shook her head. "No. I was whatever the wounded needed me to be before the next helicopter landed." Her answer carried no pride. Only memory. She spoke of long nights inside temporary surgical shelters where generators failed without warning, where dust settled onto equipment faster than it could be cleaned, where every incoming aircraft carried someone whose family had no idea whether they would ever see them again. She remembered young medics who skipped meals because patients came first. Pilots who refused medical treatment until everyone else had been stabilized. Surgeons who slept sitting upright against metal walls because there was no time to find a bed. She spoke about courage in a way that surprised Dr. Reeves because she never described it as fearlessness. Courage, she explained quietly, was simply doing the next necessary thing while fear sat beside you. Then her voice softened even further. The faces she remembered most clearly were not the ones she saved. They were the ones she couldn't. Dr. Reeves understood then why recognition had always seemed to make her uncomfortable. Every compliment reminded her of someone who had never come home. A week later the hospital received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man wearing a simple dark jacket entered the lobby carrying no military decorations, no official escort, and no desire for attention. His posture remained straight despite his age, and his eyes quietly observed everything around him before settling on the information desk. He asked only one question. "Is Emily Carter working today?" Minutes later they met in the same courtyard where she and Dr. Reeves had spoken days earlier. The man smiled with quiet warmth. "It's been a long time," he said. Emily returned the smile, though emotion quickly filled her eyes. He had once supervised medical evacuation operations during deployments where every mission carried extraordinary risk. To the hospital he appeared to be an ordinary retired veteran. To Emily he represented years of sacrifice shared by hundreds of people whose names would never appear in history books. They spoke softly about former teammates. Some had retired. Some continued serving. Some had been lost. Before leaving, the man handed Emily a small wooden challenge coin case. Inside rested a worn coin marked only by a discreet insignia and the scars of years spent in uniform pockets. No certificate accompanied it. No letter explained it. None was needed. It represented trust earned under circumstances few people would ever understand. Dr. Reeves happened to witness the exchange from a nearby window. He did not interrupt. Later that evening he asked only one question. Was he one of them? Emily nodded. He taught me that medicine isn't only about knowing what to do. It's about choosing who you become while you're doing it. Those words stayed with Dr. Reeves long after she returned to work. In the months that followed, subtle changes spread throughout the hospital. Senior surgeons became more willing to listen to younger nurses before dismissing unusual observations. Emergency drills focused not only on technical excellence but also on calm communication under pressure. Experienced staff began mentoring new employees with greater patience, remembering that remarkable wisdom sometimes arrived wearing the most ordinary uniform. None of those changes appeared in newspaper headlines. None carried Emily's name. Yet they quietly transformed the culture of the hospital more deeply than any awards ceremony could have accomplished. One rainy afternoon, the young father whose life had been saved during that first unforgettable operation returned carrying his little daughter in his arms. Neither of them knew the full story behind the surgery. They only knew they wanted to thank the people who had refused to give up. The little girl handed Emily a drawing made with bright crayons. It showed a smiling nurse standing beneath a rainbow, while a family held hands nearby. Across the top she had written, "Thank you for helping my daddy come home." Emily looked at the picture for a long time before carefully placing it inside her locker beside the worn challenge coin. Of all the honors offered to her, that simple drawing meant the most. It asked for nothing except remembrance of a life that continued because strangers had chosen compassion over comfort. Months later, during a graduation ceremony for newly hired nurses, Dr. Reeves stood before the audience and shared a lesson he wished someone had taught him decades earlier. He never mentioned classified missions or military units. He never revealed Emily's past. Instead, he said, never assume the quietest person in the room has the least to teach you. Sometimes the deepest knowledge travels without announcing itself. Emily listened from the back row, hoping no one would notice her. She preferred it that way. The applause belonged to the graduates, not to her. As everyone slowly left the auditorium, she paused beside a window overlooking the ambulance entrance where another emergency vehicle had just arrived. Somewhere inside it was another frightened family, another uncertain night, another chance to make a difference that might never be remembered outside those walls. She straightened her badge, took one steady breath, and walked toward the doors without hesitation because she had learned long ago that real service begins where recognition ends. After all, the strongest hands are often the ones no one thinks to applaud until they are the only hands left that can save a life. If this story reminded you that quiet acts of courage deserve to be remembered, consider joining this journey so that more stories of unseen compassion can continue to find their way into the light.